Good evening and welcome. I'm Trevor Morris and I'm the Dean of the Law School here at NYU. I want to welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us for the 11th annual Emile Noel Lecture here at NYU Law School. The lecture this year is being presented by His Excellency, the President of Ireland, Michael Higgins, and his lecture is titled The European Union Towards a Discourse of Reconnection, Renewal, and Hope. President Higgins will be formally introduced in just a moment by my colleague, but let me say how personally grateful I am to him for joining us tonight and how much we're all looking forward to hearing from him. Let me also say thank you to the many members of the Irish community who've joined us. I know many of you from some distance to be here tonight. We're grateful that you've joined us as well. Let me say a word or two about the Emile Noel Lecture. The lecture series is hosted by our Jean Monnet Center for International and Regional Economic Law and Justice here at NYU Law School. The Jean Monnet Center focuses on the study of international and European economic integration and European Union law, and it's directed by our colleague Grania de Burca. The Emile Noel Lecture promotes an awareness of the current state of the European Union. And each year, a prominent member of the legal and political administration of the Union is welcome to present their perspective on the state of the European Union. In recent years, we've had lectures presented by the Vice President of the European Court of Justice and the former Prime Minister of Greece, among others. It's my happy duty now to introduce Grania de Burca, who will introduce President Higgins. Grania is our Florence Ellenwood Allen Professor of Law, Faculty Director of the Hauser Global Law School, and Director of the Jean Monnet Center. She is one of the leading scholars on European Union law and its relationship to national legal systems and the international legal order. She joined us on the faculty in 2011 from Harvard, having previously spent time here as a research fellow and as a Hauser Global Visiting Professor. An outstanding scholar and teacher and colleague, Grania really is a treasured member of our community, and I'm happy to give her the microphone now. Grania de Burca.
So, Your Excellency, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to introduce tonight the person who's going to deliver the 11th annual Emile Noel Lecture at NYU and at our Jean Monnet Center for European and International Economic Law and Justice. So, as the Dean mentioned, and as you'll see from the brochure, we've been proud to welcome a line of distinguished heads of state and government from European member states and presidents of the various European institutions in previous years to give this Emile Noel Lecture. But it gives me particular pleasure this year, not only because of my own connection to the country he represents, but also for many more reasons, to welcome the President of Ireland to give this lecture. Agus tá bhór sin bhfuil fáilte mór a chur roimh an uachtaráin agus a bhean chéile chuig gulscoil nua áireach agus chuig an scoil dlí an seo nacht. So let me say a few words first about the institution of the Irish presidency before I go on to introduce the current holder of that office. So since 1938, not long after regaining its independence, Ireland has had a succession of distinguished presidents, men of dignity and character elected by popular vote to represent the Irish people and the Irish state. And the understanding is that this presidency was not to be a political office, but primarily a ceremonial one, intended to provide the nation with a figurehead, a person of high distinction, who'd represent the people on occasions, official occasions outside and inside the state. And so it was with each of the 6 men who held that office for several decades. Then in 1990, Ireland elected its first female president, Mary Robinson, who was widely considered by the end of her term to have transformed the presidency. It wasn't any longer a ceremonial role for distant, albeit highly respected figures to appear primarily on state occasions and remain largely silent on matters of the day, but she injected an enormous energy into the presidential office, reached out to different communities and spoke up on matters of social concern and justice. Her presidency was then followed by the election of another female president, Mary McAleese, who continued the high-profile, energetic style of an engaged approach and a similarly sympathetic, outreaching style. And I hope His Excellency will not be offended if I say that maybe there was some trepidation in the run-up to the recent presidential election as to whether, if a man were to be elected this time, could any man possibly live up to the expectations generated by the 2 Marys. So, but we're all delighted to say that no sooner was this current president elected than it became immediately obvious that those expectations would be more than met. So Michael D. Higgins has for several decades already been a much respected and beloved figure in Irish life and a leading public intellectual. He began his working life as a factory worker and a clerk before going on to become the first in his family to access higher education, going on to study at University College Galway, of which he's now an honorary professor, to the University of Manchester and to Indiana University here in the United States. His talents, achievements, and I would say even his identities are multiple. He's been an academic, lecturing in political science and sociology at University College Galway. He's a poet, having published 4 collections of poetry, a politician, a writer and broadcaster, a leading promoter of the arts, reinvigorating the Irish film industry, supporting the theatre, music and literature, as well as a strong promoter of the Irish language, and very importantly, a long-time human rights activist. In his political career, he's been a mayor, a TD, that is a member of the Irish Parliament, a senator, Minister for the Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht, which is the parts of Ireland where Irish is still spoken as a native language. In his political career, he's spoken often about ethics and the need for a new ethical approach to politics. And I think in his case, these haven't just been hollow words as they are for many, but his own track record as a public servant for many years and decades shows that he actually put his own advice into practice, and he stood out for his willingness to stand up for his principles, and I think where necessary, to speak out against the prevailing consensus. And while he is Ireland's first citizen and representative, his identity and his work, I think, has not just been as an Irish citizen, but also as a European citizen and as an internationally engaged actor. He's long campaigned on matters of international human rights and justice, writing and working on issues arising in Nicaragua, Chile, Cambodia, El Salvador, Iraq, and Somalia. And in 1992, he was awarded a prize named after another famous Irishman, Sean McBride, by the International Peace Bureau for this work. More recently, he's been speaking out on Europe-wide issues, including a speech to the European Parliament in 2013 on issues of citizenship, solidarity, and political legitimacy during very difficult times for the EU. And more generally, since being elected president, he's spoken out on many issues of social justice, not only in Ireland, but across Europe, including disability, poverty, economic austerity, racism, homophobia, and the refugee crisis. And always, I think, with the emphasis on the idea of inclusion and the importance of solidarity. And it's wonderful for us tonight to see such a turnout for this lecture. It's wonderful for the law school, for the university, but also for the wider Irish community, who, as the Dean said, have travelled from far and wide to be here. And tá fáilte roimh go léir an seo anocht. The topic and purpose of the Emile Noel lecture, again, as the Dean pointed out, is to reflect on the state of the European Union. And anyone who's interested in knowing something about the state of the European Union these days needs only to look at the front page of any newspaper, not only in Europe, but also here in the US. And I noticed this morning that Wolfgang Munchau, who's a writer on the EU for the Financial Times, wrote that Europe is suffering from 5 concurrent crises, a series of unforeseen shocks at different stages of development. And he mentions the refugee crisis from Syria, the Eurozone periphery debt, a global economic downturn, Russia's annexation of Crimea and its aftermath, and most recently, Volkswagen's crimes and misdemeanors. So the President's lecture tonight, he has a challenge ahead of him, could not come at a more timely moment, and we're looking forward very much to hearing what he has to say. So for all these and for many more reasons, we're delighted and honoured to welcome here tonight as our 11th annual Emile Noel lecture to speak to us on the subject of the European Union towards a discourse of reconnection, renewal and hope. His Excellency, the President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. I'm taking the phone here out.
Gwynnig Court or Firkinachas Aramvensha. Ladies and gentlemen, may I begin by thanking Dr. Gráinne de Búrca, Director of the Jean Monnet Centre for Regional and International Economic Law and Justice, here at your university, for her invitation to give the annual Emile Noel lecture. Muile buicas agus gwym gach banachtar tar an obrator siúl agat I gavan dlí san ausgal coiliúil seo berbanacht. I am convinced that the title I have given to my lecture, let me say first of all, because it is important, that it is an honor to deliver this lecture in honor of a great European, and as you have just heard, as part of a sequence of lectures that have acquired a prestigious reputation. The title I have given to my lecture is a response to what I feel is a great contemporary democratic challenge, one of a regional kind insofar as its focus is the European Union, but one that is also global, the challenge of delivering and deepening democracy. I am convinced that the challenges of connecting citizens, of creating a space for vision and innovation in theory and policy, of offering hope at a time of great change on a planet starred by growing inequality, these challenges are also global in nature. The discourse that prevails in relation to European issues at the present time, including the contributions of a distinguished but at times lonely set of academic voices, usually refers to a crisis of legitimacy in an institutional sense. And of course, the roots of this discourse on the legitimacy gap these roots are as old as the Union itself, but they have acquired an increasing urgency due to the fiscal crisis of member states, the response of different governments, and the effect that these responses have had on their citizens. I want to suggest that if we are to respond adequately to this issue of legitimacy, it requires us, I believe, to look at the social sciences, remembering that all policy at some point bases itself, or at least seeks to justify itself, in terms of some scholarship, of theoretical assumptions. In doing so, this examination of the social sciences, we need to test the transparency, the adequacy, and the power of such assumptions. Those assumptions that are at the heart of the informing theoretical fields. I suggest that the discourse I seek in the title of my lecture assumes also a pluralism of scholarship, which frankly, I believe has been in decline for some time. As a consequence, we are, as flies in a jar of honey, trapped in a single paradigm of thought in the social sciences, and above all else in economic theory, from which we are finding it difficult to escape. Yes, we perceive the need for new thinking that will source new policies that might address the human challenges of social inclusion, poverty elimination, gender equality, public health, and security in its widest sense. We perceive this need, but we seem unable to act. A world of ethical possibility seems beyond our reach. We quite often wait for rating agencies daily to indicate what kind of future might be in store for us. That single paradigm of thought to which I refer has a specific historical location. It comes from a moment of hubris that suggested that literally all aspects of life could be fitted within an explanatory frame of extreme market theory. Citizens came to be replaced conceptually from what were to be defined as consumers, who were assumed to rationally calculate how to maximize their satisfactions. That this model is now in crisis is not my suggestion. It is evident in the social statistics that we gather from developed, developing, and so-called undeveloped countries. That we need a new model is acknowledged even by conservative institutional sources. For example, in the World Development Report 2015, Mind, Society and Behavior, published recently by the World Bank Group. That report In describing the current dominant hegemonic paradigm, references, of course, Milton Friedman's famous essay of 1953 on the methodology of positive economics. The report says, the individual actor could be understood as if he behaved like a dispassionate, rational, and purely self-interested agent, since individuals who did not behave that way would be driven out of the market by those who did. The assumptions of perfect calculation and fixed and wholly self-regarding preferences embedded in standard economic models became taken for granted beliefs in many circles. But the World Development Report of 2015 then goes on to say, economics has come full circle. After a respite of about 40 years, an economics based on a more realistic understanding of human beings is being reinvented. And this report shows that a more interdisciplinary perspective on human behavior can improve the predictive power of economics and provide new tools for development policy. Such a statement acknowledges the inadequacy of the prevailing model and paradigm of economic theory, one that is usually associated with the Chicago School. Paradigms of thought, of course, do change and can change. It is obvious in the history of theoretical physics, but I believe it can happen in every area of thought, as James Joyce clearly indicated in his approach to the novel. Modernization theory in sociology is a good example. It is almost 50 years since I passed through New York for the first time on my way to study at Indiana University at Bloomington, Indiana. I was in my early 20s and one of the first Irish graduates to be offered an opportunity of postgraduate study in the social sciences in the United States. Sociology at the time was enjoying a renewed spring, different from that spring of the 19th century that had produced Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. Sociology was enjoying that spring, and many like me, in the autumn of 1966, were to be introduced to modernization theory as contained in the great canonical assertions of the Princeton studies of Gabriel Armand, Lucian Pye, Samuel Huntington, and others, with their binary evolutionary concepts of modernity versus tradition, civilization, progress, development, and the perception of the cultural features of traditional society that were perceived as hindering progress. That, of course, saw peasants as lacking, as it were, as McClelland would put it, achievement orientation. In time, such narrow frameworks did, of course, come to be questioned, and they were deconstructed by intellectually emancipated scholars after they had gone home, such as Orlando Falls-Border, and this was particularly so in the field of political science and anthropology, and paradigms changed. As to method at the time of the 1960s, there was great excitement at the new possibilities of quantification, of large-scale surveys based on sampling, and the capacity for analysis of a newly introduced large computing facility. The president of the American Philosophical Association was approached, and it was suggested that the social sciences could now be a science like the other sciences. The social sciences then went on to increasingly focus on individual opinions and preferences, rather than the discourses and politics that shaped those preferences. Preferences, it was assumed, existed separately from cognitive discourse, and they could be directly modeled in rational utility terms. Missing from the narrative of the times was any analysis of the form or the location of the changing nature of power. And at the edge of the discourse, C. Wright Mills' The Sociological Imagination stood as an accusing text to the self-satisfied times in the academy. It was a decade later at Southern Illinois that I read for the first time Alvin Goulner's The Coming Crisis of Western Sociology. And I've had that work ringing in my head through all the years. In the emphasis, as his approach to middle-range theory, the emphasis that Goulner placed on the need for good scholarship to adhere to the discipline of declaring what he called one's domain assumptions. That is the framework one took for granted as the given, the normal. He suggested this had to be declared, presented in advance, the paradigm declared. Good scholarship required one to be open, to allow one's taken for granted reality that preceded any research to be open to question. I look back not infrequently at that time when the possibility of our paradigm articulation, shift, change, scrutiny, and reflection seemed to offer a set of possibilities that would make pluralist scholarship the norm and enable scholarly hypotheses to make their way towards generating a diversity of policy options. Sadly, I say it. Sadly, many academic institutions have resigned from any commitment to such a pluralist scholarship. And this stands as background, as a global background in intellectual terms to the contemporary issues we must face, including those in the European Union. There are, of course, particular issues that arise within the Union itself, urgent issues as to whether it will be possible to have an institutional or systemic integration, which most commentators agree is necessary, and also a parallel social integration that would receive the support of the citizens of the Union. But sticking with my primary suggestion, the assumptions of theory as it informs discourse are perhaps even more important because they define what is possible and what can be imagined. The assumptions determine the basis on which power can be exercised or regulated, and they determine the basis on which issues such as integration are approached. But unchallenged theoretical frameworks, failed and failing paradigms and doctrines can disguise reality and contribute to the separation and, I suggest, the alienation of citizens from their political institutions. Now, if the current crises within Europe, and there are multiple, as I have suggested, have an intellectual as well as political and economic dimension, we must recognize too, and I do recognize, that the European Union has within it, I believe, the capacity to bring into being a new discourse that achieves a fairer, more inclusive union. One that we can come to know, understand, and with political will bring into being. But I believe that the political will, which would enable such a new vision for the future to prevail, I think it does exist and is now being evidenced, for example, at citizen level. The public response, for example, to the position of refugees arriving in Europe in recent times has, for the most part, demonstrated a deeply humanitarian instinct. If, as we all hope, 2015 is to be marked by achievements of agreements on climate change and on a new approach to sustainable development, a change of consciousness at a global level also seems possible. It beckons, as it were, in an emancipatory direction. Is it then, one might ask, also possible that to aspire to a response at European and global level to the threat to democracy that is posed by increasing global inequality and a largely unaccountable financialized global economy? So let us consider then for a moment the context in which the positive view of Europe, developed and advanced by Émile Noël and others, was conceived. For them, the memory of war and the near extension of European culture was ever present in their minds, these pioneers of the Union, in its early manifestations. and their vision was one of peace and prosperity, based on core values of reconciliation and solidarity. But in that vision, the role of the state and of the interstate institutions which were being constructed was understood as important and as mediating in nature, balancing as they did the historical tensions between the interests of capital and labor, or as Wolfgang Streeck has defined it in more recent times, balancing the objectives of social justice and market justice. That balance defined the post-war boom and served as a context for significant social progress. In the United States, too, spurred on by such work as that of Michael Harrington's The Other America, Poverty in the United States. However, it would be irrevocably broken in the period beginning in the 1980s as growth slowed and the view took hold that prosperity and the balancing of interests could only be sustained by a weakening of the state. In a relatively short period, the widely disseminated views associated earlier with Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman took a powerful grip on intellectual life. That hegemony was achieved in a conscious exercise of institutional and academic power. It released a very concrete set of political principles, and it set the terms for the position that Europe and other regions find themselves in today. Over time, policy became ensnared within a single hegemonic model built on the assumption of the human actor as a utility-maximizing rational being. These intellectual assumptions, then, were the source of an economic policy that was, for example, the very antithesis of the earlier Keynesianism of the post-war decades. And of course, as to academic work, within the academy in many places, dissent and heterodoxy would be, on some occasions, silenced and more often marginalized. And far beyond Europe, from the impact of the fall of the Berlin Wall, one can trace an ideological drift that inter alia defined language itself in a new way. For example, freedom in the public discourse becomes freedom from state regulation, support for the concept of public goods and public services, for the public world, for the enrichment of the public space, for the definition of culture, of broadcasting as a shared public activity, were all put under pressure from a populism based on radical individualism. All of it, of course, predicated on an assumption of an infinite economic growth that carried no burden of ecological responsibility or concern. The state as an institution, which after World War II had been used as an instrument to set about the rebuilding of Europe, offering health care, decent housing, and social protection to its veterans, their families, and their successors, came in the decades from the 80s to the present to be regarded as an institutional obstacle to growth and prosperity. Aspects of state regulation, of course, did survive for a while, but the financialization of the global economy was now well underway. And in the process, the profoundly ideological notion that state regulation was an obstacle to freedom came to achieve a tacit, unquestioned acceptance. Be it in the United States or the European Union, the stripping away of regulation can be shown to have shifted power to the beneficiaries of a growing inequality. And over the period since 1980, and in accelerated form in more recent years, gaps in income and wealth have widened generally and regionally in the European Union and in the United States. So thus, our present circumstances in Europe are dominated, yes, by different forms of crises, of which reference has been made already. The crisis of debt, the crisis of unemployment and economic stagnation, and institutional crises at several levels, including that challenge, ones that challenge the integrity of the Union itself. However, as a source of and foundation for economic policy, the evolution of this theoretical model of neoliberal unrestrained capitalism with minimal regulation now provokes a challenge to the democratic institutions in which citizens had placed their trust. Recognizing this reality and taking it into account in our response is central, I believe, to any understanding of the contemporary position of the European Union and the resolution of its difficulties. And I can tell you, this view is a view that is held by other heads of state in the European Union, if not all governments. The centrality of debt to the European economic crisis and to the wider question of integration has been neatly summarized inter alia by Klaus Off, giving the title Europe Entrapped to his recent article in Eurozine. Off's response to the present crisis is critical of European Union strategies to date. He writes, a central problem for the Euro rescue scheme is that the banking crisis became a state budgetary crisis, which then became the crisis of European integration we have today. This, in turn, is a crisis of renationalizing our sense of solidarity, a crisis in which the rich countries of Europe impose saving packages upon their poorer neighbors, which are supposed to win back the confidence of the finance industries. Now, if we take perhaps the most troubling of the contemporary problems, that of scandalously high and unaccountable levels of youth unemployment, we see writ large the profound consequences that economic policies and deregulation of finance have had on social cohesion, and indeed, as research has shown, on productivity at a personal and social level. For the European Union 28, the most recent Eurostat figures disclose youth unemployment running at 20.4% compared to 10.9% of the general population. You generally take the unemployment figure and multiply it by 2. In some of the worst affected members, the picture is even bleaker. Spain has an unemployment rate of 22%, but a youth unemployment rate of 48.6%. Greece has a rate of unemployment of 25%, but a youth unemployment rate that is currently running at 51.8%. And Croatia and Italy have youth unemployment rates of over 40%. The possibilities of a generation in Europe are withering in a context of confusion and, I believe inadequate policy responses. By any measure, these are stark figures, and they demonstrate the ongoing impact of the banking and financial collapse, yes, of 2007-8, and the linked issue of unsustainable public debt in many states. Yes, in Ireland, unemployment is falling and currently stands at 9.5%, but of course our further progress will be contingent on a wider European recovery, which I suggest remains fragile. At those times, however, looking back within the Union, when growth, however inadequately defined, produced surpluses, an unaccountable system could drift on. Citizens could be encouraged to compete with each other in terms of consumption in a highly individualized sense. Now, however, with inflation near zero, the demand side of the national economy continues to contract in most countries, and youth unemployment is creeping up. As economies moved from a period of growth and governments were forced to cut services and suspend infrastructural investment, fear and tension are the inevitable consequences. These consequences fall most heavily on the poor, and within society, hope is eroded among the young, whose expectations, after all, were formed in a debt-expanded, financialized economy, rather than in any version of a real economy that emphasized the possession of skills and creativity delivered in a socially purposeful way. Recognizing this intellectual and public policy context is important, I believe, for coming to terms with the disconnect between the citizens of the European Union and their representative institutions. Democratic participation is now at historically low levels across the continent. In times of economic contraction and reduced state expenditure on services, elected representatives, as in many other places and times, take the hit of public anger, as they are perceived to be the most proximate and available sources of authority, while at the same time they are perceived as powerless to act. And politics itself and the status of governments and parliaments has been eroded as crucial decisions that affect people's lives are increasingly taken outside such an institutional accountability. That is the legitimacy crisis, and it is one that is emerging at various levels. Indeed, this grounding question of legitimacy is a primary focus for thinkers such as Jürgen Habermas, Wolfgang Streeck, or Klaus Orff, who all share a broad consensus that the weakness of politics that we are witnessing in Europe has been fundamentally affected by the political changes that came about in the 80s and the 90s. In Europe, a growing gap has opened between, on the one hand, the advocates of a social Europe who simply wish, many of them of the older ones, to protect aspects of social protection, parts of which, such as the British National Health Service or Scandinavian social protection, are iconic political achievements of the past. And on the other hand, who those under the mask of labour market flexibility seek the surrender of hard-won rights in the workplace and society as the entry qualification to, if you like, an undefined global economy. The outcomes of this conflict result, as I believe, are shared, I think, in our shared vulnerable planet, being scarred by a growing inequality, an inequality that has implications for health, housing, work, participation, life itself. And that is what constitutes the concern, I believe, of many on the European street. But a response, what might have been, I think, the presentation of a choice in political terms, has been dampened by the moving of electoral competition to what is regarded as the political centre. A centre, of course, that in recent times functions under the dangerous shadow of some populisms. In some states, such a choice of the centre has come to be defined as the fullness of political choice. So I do want to say that there is nothing uniquely European about our position, although it may be that in the multi-level structure of the European Union, the tension between democracy and global markets is particularly pronounced. We are, some scholars have suggested recently, living at the emergence of a new form of capitalism with a global reach, one which existing democratic institutional arrangements are failing to render accountable. Then too, where previously forms of connection between economy and society could be contested in the political discourse and discussion of redistribution, of poverty proving, of reducing inequality was possible. Now these issues are presented as very much secondary to the management of the newly socialized public debt. And as parliaments lose capacity, as the realm of the social state shrinks, the feeling on the street is that more and more people are being asked to adjust themselves and their lives to fiscal policies which it is suggested are beyond the ken of ordinary folk. The adjustment of the citizenry to debt costs and forecasts may be called austerity, but what is masked by such a term is perceived by many as simply a submission to forces that are not under any democratic control and at the same time are delivering a transfer of wealth to private creditors. Wolfgang Streeck has described in great detail the resulting fear that is being felt in the European street, that at a global level, a capitalism without democracy is emerging. The scale of the debt problem and the ongoing economic difficulties facing Europe are enormous. And as governments struggle with these great questions, diverse proposals have been brought forward by scholars and political scientists. Jürgen Habermas makes a case for a new institutional transnationalism, while acknowledging the scale of the democratic challenge this would present. Wolfgang Streeck seeks as an alternative an exit from a dysfunctional version of monetary union badly introduced. Klaus Off takes a pessimistic view and highlights the gap between what he sees as fiscally necessary in terms of debt sharing and the political obstacles to the necessary changes across the Eurozone. Off is a representative figure when he suggests that the only possible solution may lie in the area of social policy. Now, you have been introduced to the Irish Constitution, and teasing out the various policy options at this difficult moment is the very onerous work of national governments rather than for me as a head of state. I would suggest, however, that their efforts in bringing forward economic and institutional reforms will not, if they are taken in isolation, for example, in the fiscal sphere only, address the deeper existential issues of legitimacy facing Europe. Recognizing the dominant influences, I believe, of the contemporary forms of capital and its relationship to institutional accountable forces is crucial if we are to reforge a new adequate relationship between the economic and social policy. I am not suggesting that there are not grounds for hope. The crisis at an economic and at a political level is deep, but crisis can provide an opportunity for a new strategic direction, for renewal, and for pluralist scholarship. As a beginning, however, we need, I suggest, to break free intellectually, so as to give ourselves the possibilities that our sustainable future demands. But paradigm departure can be difficult, even painful. In a passage near the end of his famous book, The History of Development, Gilbert Rist wrote of the difficulty of getting to a new paradigm in intellectual work and policy. Only a new paradigm can alter not the way things are, but our way of conceiving them. That is, can make it possible for us to think what is today unthinkable. History shows us a series of turnarounds that have changed the face of the world. What value today have the certainties of Galileo's adversaries, of the inquisitors hunting down witches, of the colonizers so full of their sacred trust of civilization? We are not living in circumstances that cannot be changed. Inequality at global, regional, or national levels is not some form of natural law. Heads of state, heads of government, legislators, civil society, many are now recognizing that distributional issues are a necessary part of the discourse that is necessary if we are to restore the possibility of the legitimacy that is needed for systemic integration. But the need for revision of institutional architecture in the European Union has to be primarily directed at the needs of the Union and its citizens. And only within that can the systemic institutional change needed in relation to the banking sector, the currency, and economic stability be achieved. As to how we can act in response to the economic issues, and particularly issues, social issues such as youth unemployment, in the short term, yes, there are proposals available to us in such work as that of Professor Anthony Atkinson, for example, in his recent work Inequality. He explores the specific historical and political contexts and causes of contemporary forms of inequality. And he makes the following observation. Crucially, I do not accept that rising inequality is inevitable. It is not solely the product of forces outside our control. There are steps that can be taken by governments, acting individually or collectively, by firms, by trade unions and consumer organizations, and by us as individuals, to reduce the present levels of inequality. And I was delighted to know that Professor Atkinson will chair the new Commission on Global Poverty, which is being set up by the World Bank. Professor Atkinson goes on to make some proposals for policy, which I believe could be implemented within the parameters of the European Union. The proposals would build a social floor for the European Union, but also, I believe, in their exemplary effect, would have a global reach in addressing inequality. These are Professor Atkinson's proposals, not mine. But their central feature is that addressing inequality, arresting its deepening, breaking the cycle of exclusion and alienation is achievable. In this regard, I have previously pointed out in the speeches I made to the European Parliament and the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, the obligations that arise under the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms and the obligations that arise under the revised Social Charter of the Council of Europe, I refer to them as providing an existing rights framework for such a social floor. And such proposals could serve as a beginning for the rebuilding of a social Europe, and do so within existing constitutional arrangements. And I find these suggestions attractive and valuable. I do ask myself, however, could this ever make its way into the current discourse in the European Union at institutional and political level? Yes, we should remember the great achievements that have been made possible in the past. At its periods of greatest achievement and progress, the European Union has inspired the loyalty of its citizens because of the hope it represented of a better society for all. If it is to survive and to flourish, Europe must regain the power to inspire and to offer hope. The Union has much to be proud of, after all, and to celebrate, and European membership has given impetus to so many inclusive decisions in member states. In the Irish case, membership of the Union has been a powerful impetus towards gender equality, for example. Its influence on environmental responsibility has been immense, and it has been used as both source and shelter for government decisions on sustainability. The principle, then, of free movement of peoples was once seen as a core value to be celebrated rather than merely as a labour market instrument or a legal rule to be circumvented. It was a cornerstone of the idea of Europe that enabled cultural and social interaction on an unprecedented scale. Just one example. In the area of education, the Erasmus scheme allowed young European people to study and work in other member states, exposing them to a different linguistic and cultural environment at a formative stage in their lives. Since 1987, 3 million Europeans have taken part in Erasmus, with 40% going on to settle abroad, and 1/3 marrying a citizen from another state. The Commission estimates that there have been 1 million babies born of Erasmus, in what Umberto has described as a sexual revolution, sweeping Europe, which he has argued should be extended beyond students to workers also. Travel is the nourishment for integration. And it may be, sadly, a fact, but predictable, that policies of fiscal consolidation or council reform are unlikely to produce such a romantic or demographic dividend. In the task of fostering political will for reform, the importance of symbolism, too, should not be underestimated. When intergovernmental meetings are called to discuss where the European Union must go, they usually conclude with a joint statement and what is called the family photograph. But on the street, very often what citizens believe they are hearing is not the necessary invitation to an urgent or any new understanding of economic or political circumstance, not to speak of change. As a result, for many, when the conditions of life itself cannot be reconciled with the image of authority and care on offer, they are pushed to ask the question, have things spun out of control? Has a new and unbridgeable fissure between public and power emerged? And in responding to this crisis then, and its institutional sources, Some public intellectuals speak of what they see as an irreformable reality, of the need for a new moment of confrontation and total change when existing institutions can be swept away. I've read Slavoj Žižek's work as well, and I note this in it. But this may be heady stuff, but there are also those who see and recognize the human costs of such an outcome, who see how old badges of difference, ethnicity, belief, and bankrupt certainties of the past, so often and dangerously claimed to be absolute, could quickly move into the vacuum that would be created by a weakened parliamentarism, a shrunken state. How easily our publics could drift into a resile of old hatreds based on distortions. I remain committed to the European vision and to the founding principles of Europe. I believe that we still possess the capacity to provide the foundations for a renewed and strengthened union. But yet to provide hope, a positive vision at this crucial moment, I believe we must rediscover the enabling and inspiring principle of solidarity. Solidarity within the union and solidarity with the wider world. For after all, when Europe was in ruins after the war, the destruction was unavoidably in one's gaze. And then when European growth rates were achieved within a social model, modest redistributions could take place. And it may not have seemed necessary to have a widespread economic literacy. Many, assuming all was well, could drift from political participation. Adjustments in living conditions could be for activists the stuff of political competition as to the disposal of the fruits of growth. And a debate we should, I think, on structure seemed unnecessary. But we should remember, too, that period of the European Union's history when solidarity was privileged, when combat poverty, for example, was born in the 1970s and issues of inequality were addressed. And it is well within the capacity of the European publics to craft a new policy and institutional order, one that combines social cohesion with competitiveness. But the danger at the moment is that the discourse has stalled under the pressure of an insufficient paradigm of connection between economy and society. And the further danger is that without the political support of its people, the necessary institutional and policy changes will become ever less possible. So rebuilding a social Europe, I suggest, may require greatly increased tax and spend capacities on the part of the EU institutions. But at present, the political will for such policies and for the necessary ceding of sovereignty from the national level simply does not exist. But political will and reviving an active European citizenship requires comprehension, understanding, and participation by citizens, facilitated, I suggest, by an economic literacy. And may I suggest that if literacy was an essential tool in securing the right to vote and be heard in Parliament in a previous century, now in contemporary conditions, economic literacy that can demystify banking, fiscal, and real economy crisis seems necessary if we are to achieve an inclusive discourse, one that can address the widely reported alienation of citizens. Surely this is necessary if in the contemporary period mediating institutions are becoming sidelined or neglected, and publics are reflecting their alienation in non-participation in political choice. And the vacuum, I repeat, that has emerged is becoming available to populist extremes. Old and dangerous fundamentalisms, old and bogus certainties are being resurrected to justify exclusions, create fears, and revive hate. And if the crisis then of legitimacy is to be reversed, and I believe it can, recognizing the consequences of a limiting paradigm in our intellectual work is a necessary beginning. We can, I believe, save the European vision, and we in doing so are saving a model in which peoples of other continents have placed their hopes. At general level, The perception of our interdependency, which lies at the heart of Émile Noël's Europe, can be the basis for possibilities of joint action on issues such as climate change, the elimination of global poverty, the ending of gender violence, and a restructuring of global debt. Reviving solidarity holds the best prospect of re-engaging electorates also. Just reflect for a moment on what would be the response among its publics to the European Union's agreeing to implement a social agenda derived from the economic, social and cultural rights and the supporting protocols of the Council of Europe. Imagine the value of a meaningful guarantee of rights to food, shelter, education and health. I think a reconstituted discourse for the European Union can be part two of a global discourse that can build on commitments in relation to global challenges, such as sustainable development and climate change. And Europe can embrace these and other challenges in conscious recognition too, but rejection of an old legacy that many of its members share, one of imperialism, of economic exploitation, political manipulation, and gender and cultural exclusion, which some of its members must face and transact as part of their past so as to enable their present to be democratic, and if they are to protect their future for its best possibilities and potentialities. Recent developments and global challenges, I believe, can be turned in a new direction for the European Union, building a union that will be an exemplar for other regions, promoting a new global and regional set of choices as to the appropriate connections between economy and society, ethics and ecological responsibility. And the European Union can, in its response to the present migrant and refugee flows from the neighbourhood of the Union, create a model also for appropriate response to such issues. If it were not to do so, the evidence is that such an issue could confound the best of European values, with new xenophobic parties being the beneficiaries in a sea of populist tendencies. But when we see the overwhelming popular support for compassionate and generous policies at this time, we should be left in no doubt that solidarity both within the Union and with our neighbouring regions is both possible and can be a powerful unifying value. And then too within the economic sphere, redefining work itself as a human activity in a contemporary interdependent global economy, the European Union can make a significant contribution in confronting the creation of the new precariat that is emerging at a global level. At times, this growing phenomenon of insecure work sails under a flag of convenience called labour market flexibility. But it is really about deregulation and the erosion of rights, security and benefits painfully gained over generations. And this is a universal issue, one not confined to the European Union, but one where, again, given the political will and its strong legal framework and tradition, the European Union could be exemplary. The glaring inequalities of our globe must be recognized as the threat they constitute to democracy everywhere. If what has been called by some scholars the transition from democracy within capitalism to capitalism without democracy, and I repeat, if politics in its practice becomes hollow, if economic literacy is not to be provided for as a necessary tool in the most public discourse, the argument on legitimacy will not simply be in the economic sphere. It will be about democracy itself. Conducting an analysis, then, that might suggest a suite of regulatory responses to global financial flows, that as well could be a contribution of the European Union and help bring into reality the new sustainable development goals that we're agreeing this weekend, crafting into them the human rights principles upon which so many scholars have contributed. We are at a defining moment. The scale and complexity of the challenges we face are daunting, but we have great resources with which to face them. The rich and profoundly ethical intellectual heritage of Europe, which we neglect, and we can call to on the words and actions of the founding visionaries of European cooperation, such as Émile Noël. The tasks that we must undertake are political and institutional, but they're also intellectual and moral. That is the purpose of my lecture. And we have together at global level and in the European Union a wonderful opportunity to play to the potential of our possibilities, na féidirachtaí gan teorainn, as we say in Irish, to define our interdependency in terms of human vulnerability and care. I believe we should take our opportunity, and I believe that in doing so, we will be very European indeed. Thank you very much.
So after that extremely powerful, rich and rousing speech, which I think is in equal parts sobering and inspiring, the President has very kindly agreed to take questions for some time and to engage in a dialogue with some of you. So let me say that the floor is open for any questions, interventions. I see one question from Professor Lanfried in the floor here. If there's a microphone here, perhaps it could be brought over to Professor Lanfried. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Your Excellency, for this wonderful vision. I think it is especially important that you had this talk at a university, which is so big like the NYU. And here are the young people sort of who are more important than my generation, who is sort of not shaping anymore really the events. So if we agree with really many of the points you have made, you had in the beginning a very interesting point that you said, well, the institutions will not have the political power to put this into practice, but the citizens. What we saw now with the refugee crisis, they could have the political will. The danger I see, of course, that this moment when the citizens could really become important is a moment when we have this really unemployment, economic bad situation, this divide between rich and poor, and many of the citizens, I think, are not in the sort of situation that they really can keep up this very good move. And so at the moment, in such a situation where we have economic pressure, I think it's a big danger, and the chance for the citizens is very small.
Well, it's a very interesting set of problems that you summarize. I see the decline of influence of the mediating institutions combined with the leeching of power from parliaments as a very dangerous circumstance. Those of us who have been are interested in political science and philosophy can reflect on what literature is available to us. There are some people who have written off the state altogether. And for example, I have argued against that in the past on the basis that it took such a great struggle for poor people to access democracy through parliament and through control of the levers of the state. Why would you walk away? Yes, it is very attractive to say that you can have an extreme communitarianism, for example, in which you ignore it altogether, but that in fact will not achieve the change that is necessary to reduce global inequality. You then turn over to the other side in relation to it, and you take up the debate about which is not a popular one, about the notion that, which became, remember, very popular, we need a little state, get the state out of our lives. The language we use, for example, There are parts of the world, believe it or not, who believe you should pay taxes for a decent society. But the usual phrase is, I'm addressing the tax burden, you know. Now, we have to make our mind up if you say that you want to be a citizen and if you want to live socially. Equally in relation to the word union, I have discussed with our heads of state in Europe how appalling the language was in relation to some in recent times, in relation to crises within the European Union. Even divisions between debtor and creditor nations, northern and southern nations, and so forth. If you're in a union and you accept Emile Noël's definition and so forth, it could be assumed as a minimum that you actually think of the other citizens in the union as just that, shared citizens in a space that someone has decided to call the European Union. So I think we are all challenged. I thought I'm shuddered to suggest it to you, a longer version of this paper, but part of it in relation, why I decided to begin with the scholarship is that I think it is a very serious issue. I am in favor very strongly of scholarly work. But what I describe as this dominating paradigm of thinking, it is crippling people because remember that when I make reference to Galileo Galilei, what the inquisitors said to him, you know, we cannot argue with what you are saying, but the world has to be flat. Now, we are in that position in relation to where we are. I strongly subscribe to what has been achieved in relation to the new debate on sustainability and climate change. This is so necessary for our future. But we have to be able, if we are scholars, to keep our minds open. And we have to acknowledge the rights of students to hear pluralist teaching. Remember, in the 1980s, the students in Paris and in Cambridge protested, not on a left-right basis at all, but on the right to be taught in a pluralist way. And equally, I know many colleagues, when I was an academic, who paid the price in relation to what became an academic tyranny in relation to the model. I would be dishonest intellectually if I didn't address that issue. So what I think what one can do, there are great, I've started in economics. There are great moments in economic theory. And I'm in favor of the training that will enable you to measure different things. But I actually refuse to have an instrument regarded as a methodology and either to be regarded as a theory and so forth unless you put your assumptions on the table. And that's what good scholarship is. So what you need in Europe is good scholarship, public policy that is informed, and you do it in a way in which the discourse can include people. You then take choices on a basis of consensus, not seeking perfection and not seeking to win in a simple way, but then to move on. And all of this is possible. And I would argue that's the European tradition. There are intellectual resources for that in Europe. But this debate equally is a debate about the United States. I don't think anyone is suggesting that we are on a massive run towards equality in the United States either after the recent financial crisis. You know, but that's for another day.
Hi, my name is Aaron Vallely and I'm actually from Dublin. Michael, in the first year of your presidency, you had a series of workshops for young people where we drew up a constitution by young people for young people, and at the top of that constitution there was a series, I think it was about 4 or 5 particular things we wanted to achieve, and one of them was same-sex marriage. And as of May, we became the first country in world history ever to legislate for same-sex marriage by popular vote. Now, there are many people such as Joseph Stiglitz, Thomas Piketty, and our own David McWilliams who are talking about an intergenerational disparity. So could you say something perhaps about young people taking leadership and the discrepancy between young people and older people? Or as Tony Benn, the late Tony Benn said, the middle-aged people screwing the older and younger.
I've often restrained myself from quoting Oscar Wilde that youth is wasted on the young. But I would never believe that. I think being young is an extraordinary time. When I said when I was standing for the presidency and in my inauguration statement that I would have a series of themes that I would address. The first one was I had originally called it being young in Ireland, but because so many young people had left Ireland, I changed it to being young and Irish. And I consulted, I think, altogether with more than 800 young people, and young people in different circumstances, but home and abroad, some in prisons and some in different places, and they were wonderful. And there were regional consultations, but one of the most striking things was how equality was never outside of the first three in any of the rankings that we had in any of the consultations. And there was a powerful emphasis on ethics. So therefore, my second consultation that I had was on ethics. And it's very interesting, you know, rather than when I was being introduced in the reference to Volkswagen, you know, I think one would like to think that the notion of corporate ethics isn't an oxymoron. But we had a huge consultation on ethics as well. But what is interesting here is that I'm sharing something with you as well, is that I do think that there is, in fact, a great wish among young people. And they're very good. One of the things about it, for example, sometimes you had a very kind of negative right-wing view that was suggesting that if only we could transport ourselves into the past, everyone would be ethical and so forth. I encountered an extraordinary ethics of friendship among young people, a caring for people, and even ones after I had visited funerals of young people and so forth. The language itself, you were always there for me, or something like that, indicated this powerful ethical resource among the young. And that is everywhere. And that is why you owe it in scholarship, and in the scholarship that informs policy, to actually say to people, we are open to rethinking the models of connection so that you can be included and do it in a different way. At my age, and looking back across different transitions in economic theory, and I had the fortune of being in the different subjects of economics, politics, and sociology, and anthropology, and so forth. But we are at an extraordinary moment where technology and science has changed the nature of production. You are now in a position where you really, even those who are very conservative economically, would argue that you can't take the existing structure or its immediate projection as being able to give you any kind of distribution that will give you a demand curve and so forth. So what have you to do? You have to find a new way of defining work. Work, for example, recognizing the importance of sharing care. All the question of the unrecognized woman's work that has gone on in different societies for some time, which is quite scandalous. So the idea, if you like, that you can continue with the existing definition of work is not viable economically, and no serious economist is arguing that it is. So therefore you have to rethink that out. That will have implications as well for how you talk about how you work in the globalized economy. It is a huge issue to which I have, when I started in the 1970s, the big issue was making multinational corporations accountable. Now you indeed have, as you have heard in the question, Thomas Piketty's work and other people's work, which suggesting that rather like a physics flow, you have for every invested euro or dollar in the productive economy, you have 8 floating, as it were, in a system that is seeking to be attracted to Earth for reward. That creates many, many implications in relation to the future of a financialized economy. And the issue then, as it were, about citizens being able to enter the discourse if you are to ask yourself which offers the best prospect for Europe, a wide debate in which citizens are able to debate the connection between economy and society and tax and fiscal issues? Or do you, as some have suggested, you just have a European fiscal council of fiscal councils, in which you say, remember, I think Friedrich van Hayek was very, very honest. He said that people can't understand these complex issues, so you just get on without them. But that's not that you can see what the implications of that for democracy. We are at that point. That's why I make the case very strongly in my lecture for a kind of economic literacy. And I think that this can happen. And also, I think it would be great. People will enjoy it. There is nothing that cannot be understood. There is absolutely nothing that cannot be achieved. And I think that the world is full of possibilities. I love hearing these questions from young people. My wish for them is not to waste their lives on the old models, but to actually look at the world and recognize all the possibilities of beauty and sharing that there is in it. But the one thing that is clear is that a miserable, extreme individualism is destructive of the person, destructive of the world, and offers no future.
I'm conscious of time marching on, and a less cerebral but no less enjoyable part of the evening awaiting outside with our reception. But I see another young person's hand up, and I would like to invite you to put your question to the President.
Your Excellency, many thanks for your wonderfully insightful comments this evening. My name is Ikra, and I'm from Dublin as well. I'm studying here at the NYU School of Law. I'm a postgrad student. Just with reference to the 2013 Council of European Union Directive on the minimum or reception conditions directive for minimum standards set for asylum seekers entering the European Union. Do you believe that Ireland's decision to opt out of that directive, along with the decisions of the UK and Denmark, is going to hinder European integration and cooperation in the area of asylum law, particularly in light of the recent wave of refugees entering the EU? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I am in the difficult position, as when I was being introduced, of my new constitutional position, of not being political in the small p sense. But I have spoken on all of those issues when I was in Parliament. But you do raise an issue that is, I think, important. Remember the stress I lay on the Council of Europe's proposal. That is my starting point, frankly. And I think that you also note the part in my lecture where I mention about how, in fact, the argument for so-called labour market flexibility is disguising rights issues very strongly. And I think we have to get to a point, rather like the figures I gave, where people are moving across a space with rights, where I think there are the people who we're really, there's been a very, I gave other lectures on the human rights side of things, but we've 60 million displaced people on the planet at the present time. Surely, really, they raise new rights discourses for us and relate to it. You also have so many people who are between states, raising the issue, which I'm sure is often discussed, about whether you have to be sedentary or within a state to access your rights and so forth. I have most of my life spoken about you need to give an equivalence, full equivalence of rights to people who arrive. There are different ways in which I had conversations with some others recently about how you would do it in relation to both refugees and migrants. First of all, in refugees, you really should have no choice because you should fulfill your international legal obligations. In relation to other movements and so forth, one of the things that you can do, and it is interesting, that in the present circumstance in the neighbourhood of Europe, you have, if you like, the countries who are with the least financial capacity are on the front line. I'm talking about Greece, Italy, Malta, countries like that. So what you have to try and do, I can't discuss this evening the implications of Dublin 3 either, but one of the things that you can, that you need to do is the World Bank, in its response to the new debate we've had in New York on sustainable development, has a document called From Billions to Trillions, and it suggests that it may be possible to take that speculative thing that I mentioned, the 8-to-1 ratio, and transfer it in some kind of way but it acknowledges, to be fair to it, that it will be very difficult to make that transition. And I would say to all those who make the case, and they were very loud this weekend at the United Nations, that we must in fact address global poverty by having a huge presence of the private sector. You might ask, what's your record on human rights? What are your proposals for human rights? What are your proposals in relation to what I call a precariat, and so forth? See, this is why these debates are essential. And I think, being very practical, if, for example, one took, you could do it through an international financial structure of bonds and whatever, release funds, which the interest would be paid by states receiving people. For example, people don't hear it often enough that in relation to the German economy, the provision, if you want to be able to keep the pension requirement even, you need 230,000 migrants a year. And the other studies is that within 3 years, all of them, in fact, are paying more into the exchequer than any benefits that they're receiving. This is when they are accorded full social benefits. So the demography of the European Union, I didn't go into my paper because it is quite a complex issue. But if we are the world in the same way, this is where you have to think globally. You have to think ethically globally. And you have to think in a scholarly way. By 2050, the youngest continent on the planet will be Africa. What is our approach to that? And yes, there's a great case to be made for the African economic development in different forms should be done in an African way, and so forth. And this question of why people move and so on has to be looked at in a way that does indeed, as you say, accord rights. These derogations, these notions, I'm not so sure that I don't want to speak specifically because my relationship with the Irish government is a warm one. And we are all very happy. We allow each other to do our different things, but there it is. I do appreciate your question. We really remember it is how you look after your migrants and your refugees, your people in prison. That's how you will be defined. And like the young man who asked me to think, dear God, it would be an awful thing to be some kind of an old conservative before you were 30. It would be mentally you can stay alive for a long, long time. You should be youthful forever.
So I think we've had a truly outstanding evening tonight, a wonderful, incredibly challenging and rich speech from the President and a very engaging debate, which I feel could go on much longer, but I have to spoil the party and say that all good things must come to an end, but that we'll be continuing to mingle and speak to one another at the reception outside. But let me first thank all of you here once again for coming, for attending a very memorable event, and from coming, many of you from afar, to hear the President speaking. I also want to just say a thank you to all of those who helped to make the event possible, because of course it takes some organization to manage the fan club, the very extensive fan club of someone like President Higgins. And so I want to thank all of those at NYU who helped with this evening's events, to special events, the Alumni and Development Office staff, especially Nicole Jones, Bruce White, Elizabeth Thomas, Kelly Spencer, Jamila Humphrey, to the staff also at Glucksman Ireland House, and particularly Anne Solari, who helped, to the Irish Consulate and the Department of Foreign Affairs. But I want to say thank you especially to one person who has devoted herself night and day since sometime in August, virtually non-stop as far as I can tell, to judge from the emails I get in the middle of the night, at weekends, on holidays, and that's Claudia Golden. So I would like to ask all of you to thank Claudia. And as I mentioned, once the lecture concludes and President Higgins has left the room, we'll continue our exchange and discussion across the hall in the Griesberg Lounge, where we'll have a reception, and you're all warmly invited to attend that. So let me finish by once again just thanking President Higgins for a really marvelous evening, for a wonderful speech. He's really given us, I think, a call to intellectual, political and social arms, even though it wasn't a political speech, I hesitate. And he's even called for, I think, a sexual revolution to be extended beyond students across Europe. President Higgins, thank you very much.